Where am I? Hello? Where am I? There I am. Hi, everybody. Welcome in. Welcome to our, Lady Twyla Fugo Reeb. Hi, Bryant. Hi, Reeb. Hi, Frankie. Welcome to our Chill Sunday reading streams. That may or may not be chill. You never know with Edgar Allan Poe. Please read the rules as usual. I won't be able to respond to every comment while I'm reading. I might not respond to every comment regardless of reading. But, yeah. Not sure how far we'll go today. It depends on, Ooh, that one's long, isn't it? We shall see. We'll judge. Hour and a half, 2 hours seems to be good for our reading streams. Frankie, I am so sorry that you missed me beating the Abyss Watchers. I'm so sorry. All right. Let's begin. No point in dilly-dally. King Pest. A tale containing an allegory. As per usual, we have a prologue, or what is this called again? I forget what this is called. Thank you, Bryant. The gods do bear and well allowing kings, the things which they abhor in rascal roots. Buckhurst's Tragedy of Ferrex and Porrex. About 12 o'clock one night in the month of October, and during the chivalrous reign of the 3rd Edward, 2 seamen belonging to the crew of the Free and Easy, a trading schooner plying between Sluys and the Thames, and then anchor in that river, were much astonished to find themselves seated in the taproom of an alehouse in the parish of St. Andrews, London, which alehouse bore for the sign of the portraiture of a jolly tar. The room, although ill-contrived, smoke-blackened, low-pitched, and in every other respect agreeing with the general character of such places at the period, was, nevertheless, in the opinion of the grotesque groups scattered here and there within it, sufficiently well adapted to its purpose. Of these groups our 2 seamen formed, I think, the most interesting, if not the most conspicuous. The one who appeared to be the elder and whom his companion had just addressed by the characteristic appellation of legs was at the time much the taller of the 2. He might have measured 6 feet and a half, and a habitual stoop in the shoulders seemed to have been the necessary consequence of an altitude so enormous. Superfluities in height were, however, more than accounted for by deficiencies in other respects. He was exceedingly thin, and might, as his associates asserted, have answered, when drunk, for a pennant at the masthead, or when sober, have served for a jib-boom. But these jests and others of a similar nature had evidently produced, at no time, any effect upon the cachinnatory muscles of the tar. With high cheekbones, a large hawk nose, retreating chin, fallen underjaw, and huge protruding white eyes, the expression of his countenance, although tinged with a species of dogged indifference to matters and things in general, was not the less utterly solemn and serious beyond all attempts at imitation or description. The younger seaman was, in all outward appearance, the converse of his companion. His stature could not have exceeded 4 feet. A pair of stumpy bow legs supported his squat, unwieldy figure, while his unusually short and thick arms, with no ordinary fists at their extremities, swung off dangling from his sides like the fins of a sea turtle. Small eyes, of no particular color, twinkled far back in his head. His nose remained buried in the mass of flesh which enveloped his round, full, and purple face, and his thick upper lip rested upon the still thicker one beneath an air of complacent self-satisfaction, much heightened by the owner's habit of licking them at intervals. He evidently regarded his tall shipmate with a feeling of half wondrous, half quizzical, and stared up occasionally in his face as the red setting sun stares up at the crags of Ben Nevis. Various and eventful, however, had been the peregrinations of the worthy couple in and about the different tap-houses of the neighborhood during the earlier hours of the night. Funds, even the most ample, are not always everlasting, and it was with empty pockets our friends had ventured upon the present hostelry. At the precise period, then, when this history properly commences, Legs and his fellow, Hugh Tarpaulin, sat each with both elbows resting upon the large oaken table in the middle of the floor, and with a hand upon each cheek. They were eyeing, from behind a huge flagon of unpaid-for humming stuff, the portentous words, "No chalk," which to their indignation and astonishment were scored over the doorway by means of that very mineral whose presence they purported to deny. Not that the gift of deciphering written characters, a gift among the commonalty of that day considered little less cabalistic than the art of inditing, could, in strict justice, have been laid to the charge of either disciple of the sea. But there was, to say the truth, a certain twist in the formation of the letters, an indescribable lee lurch about the whole, which foreboded, in the opinion of both seamen, a long run of dirty weather, and determined them at once, in the allegorical words of Legs himself, to pump ship, clew up all sail, and scud before the wind. Having accordingly disposed of what remained of the ale and looped up the points of their short doublets, they made a bolt for the street. Although tarpaulin rolled twice into the fireplace, mistaking it for the door, yet their escape was at length happily effected, and half after 12 o'clock found our heroes ripe for mischief and running for life down a dark alley in the direction of St. Andrew's Stair, hotly pursued by the landlady of the Jolly Tar. At the epoch of this eventful tale, and periodically for many years before and after, all England, but more especially the metropolis, resounded with the fearful cry of plague. The city was in a great measure depopulated, and in those horrible regions in the vicinity of the Thames, where amid the dark and narrow and filthy lanes and alleys, the demon of disease was supposed to have laid his nativity, awe, terror, and superstition were alone to be found stalking abroad. By authority of the king, such districts were placed under ban, and all persons forbidden under pain of death to intrude upon their dismal solitude. Yet neither the mandate of the monarch nor the huge barriers erected at the entrances of the street, nor the prospect of that loathsome death which, with almost absolute certainty, overwhelmed the wretch whom no peril could deter from adventure, prevented the unfurnished and untenanted dwellings from being stripped by the hand of nightly rapine of every article, such as iron, brass, or lead work, which could in any manner be turned to a profitable account. Above all, it was usually found upon the annual winter opening of the barriers that locks, bolts, and secret cellars had proved but slender protection to those rich stores of wines and liquors which, in consideration of the risk and trouble of removal, many of the numerous dealers having shops in the neighborhood had consented to trust, during the period of exile, to so insufficient a security. But there were very few of the terror-stricken people who attributed these doings to the agency of human hands. Pest spirits, plague goblins, and fever demons were the popular imps of mischief, and tales so blood-chilling were hourly told that the whole mass of forbidden buildings was, at length, enveloped in terror as in a shroud, and the plunderer himself was often scared away by the horrors his depredations had created, leaving the entire vast circuit of prohibited district to gloom, silence, pestilence, and death. It was by one of the terrific barriers already mentioned, and which indicated the region beyond to be under the pest band, that, in scrambling down an alley, Legs and the worthy Hugh Tarpaulin found their progress suddenly impeded. To return was out of the question, and no time was to be lost, as their pursuers were close upon their heels. With thoroughbred seamen to clamber up the roughly fashioned plankwork was a trifle, and, maddened with the twofold excitement of exercise and liquor, they leaped unhesitatingly down the enclosure, and holding their drunken course with shouts and yelling, were soon bewildered in its noisome and intricate recesses. Had they not, indeed, been intoxicated beyond moral sense, their reeling footsteps must have been palsied by the horrors of their situation. The air was cold and misty. The paving stones loosened from their beds lay in wild disorder amid the tall, rank grass which sprang up from around the feet and ankles. Fallen houses choked up the streets. The most fetid and poisonous smells everywhere prevailed, and by the aid of that ghastly light which, even at midnight, never fails to emanate from a vapory and pestilential atmosphere, might be discerned lying in the bypaths and alleys or rotting in the windowless habitations, the carcass of many a nocturnal plunderer arrested by the hand of the plague in the very perpetration of his robbery. But it lay not in the power of images or sensations or impediments such as these to stay the course of men who, naturally brave, and at that time especially, brimming full of courage and of humming stuff, would have reeled, as straight as their condition might have permitted, undauntedly into the very jaws of death. Onward, still onward, stalked the grim Legs, making the desolate solemnity echo and re-echo with yells like the terrific war whoop of the Indian, and onward, still onward, rolled the dumpy Tarpaulin, hanging onto the doublet of his more active companion, and far surpassing the latter's most strenuous exertions in the way of vocal music by bull roarings and basso, from the profundity of his stentorian lungs. They had now evidently reached the stronghold of the pestilence. Their way at every step or plunge grew more noisome and more horrible, the paths more narrow and intricate. Huge stones and beams falling momently from the decaying roofs above them gave evidence, by their sullen and heavy descent, of the vast height of the surrounding houses. And while actual exertion became necessary to force a passage through the frequent heaps of rubbish, it was by no means seldom that the hand fell upon a skeleton or rested upon a more fleshly corpse. Suddenly, as the seaman stumbled against the entrance of a tall and ghastly-looking building, a yell more than usually shrill from the throat of the excited legs was replied to from within, in a rapid succession of wild, laughter-like, and fiendish shrieks. Nothing daunted at sounds which of such a nature, at such a time, and in such a place, might have curdled the very blood in hearts less irrevocably on fire. The drunken couple rushed headlong against the door, burst it open, and staggered into the midst of things with a volley of curses. The room within which they found themselves proved to be the shop of an undertaker, but an open trap door in a corner of the floor near the entrance looked down upon a long range of wine cellars, whose depths the occasional sound of bursting bottles proclaimed to be well stored with their appropriate contents. In the middle of the room stood a table, in the center of which arose a huge tub of what appeared to be punch. Bottles of various wines and cordials, together with jugs, pitchers, and flagons of every shape and quality, were scattered profusely upon the board. Around it, upon coffin trestles, was seated a company of 6. This company I will endeavor to delineate one by one. Fronting the entrance and elevated a little above his companions sat a personage who appeared to be the president of the table. His stature was gaunt and tall, and Legs was confounded to behold in him a figure more emaciated than himself. His face was yellow as saffron, but no feature excepting one alone was sufficiently marked to merit a particular description. This one consisted in a forehead so unusually and hideously lofty as to have the appearance of a bonnet of crown of flesh superadded upon the natural head. His mouth was puckered and dimpled into an expression of ghastly affability, and his eyes, as indeed the eyes of all at table, were glazed over with the fumes of intoxication. This gentleman was clothed from head to foot in a richly embroidered black silk velvet pall, wrapped negligently around his form after the fashion of a Spanish cloak. His head was struck full of sable hearse plumes, which he nodded to and fro with a jaunty and knowing air, and in his right hand he held a human thigh bone, which he appeared to have been just knocking down some member of the company for a song. Opposite and with her back to the door was a lady of no whit the less extraordinary character. Although quite as tall as the person just described, she had no right to complain of his unnatural emaciation. She was evidently in the last stage of a dropsy, and her figure resembled nearly that of the huge puncheon of October beer which stood, with the head driven in, close by her side, in a corner of the chamber. Her face was exceedingly round, red, and full, and had the same peculiarity, or rather want of peculiarity, attached itself to her countenance, which I before mentioned in the case of the president. That is to say, only one feature of her face was sufficiently distinguished to need a separate characterization. Indeed, the acute tarpaulin immediately observed that the same remark might have applied to each individual person of the party, every one of whom seemed to possess a monopoly of some particular portion of physiognomy. When the lady in question, this portion proved to be the mouth. Commencing at the right ear, it swept with a terrible chasm to the left, the short pendants which she wore in either auricle continually bobbing into the aperture. She made, however, every exertion to keep her mouth closed and look dignified, in a dress consisting of a newly starched and ironed shroud coming up close under her chin with a crumpled ruffle of cambric muslin. At her right sat a diminutively young lady, whom she appeared to patronize. This delicate creature, in the trembling of her wasted fingers, in the livid hue of her lips, and in the slight hectic spot which tinged her otherwise leaden complexion, gave evident indications of a galloping consumption. An air of extreme haut ton, however, pervaded her whole appearance. She wore in a graceful and dégagé manner a large and beautiful winding sheet of the finest India lawn. Her hair hung in ringlets over her neck, a soft smile played about her mouth, but her nose, extremely long, thin, sinuous, flexible, and pimpled, hung far below her underlip, and in spite of the delicate manner in which she now moved it, now and then moved it to one side or the other with her tongue, gave to her countenance a somewhat equivocal expression. Ugh. Over against her and upon the left of the dropsicle lady was seated a little puffy, wheezing, and gouty old man, whose cheeks reposed upon the shoulders of their owner like two huge bladders of Oporto wine. With his arms folded and one huge bandaged leg deposited upon the table, he seemed to think himself entitled to some consideration. He evidently prided himself much upon every inch of his personal appearance, but took more especial delight in calling attention to his gaudy-colored surtout. This, to say the truth, must have cost him no little money, and was made to fit him exceedingly well, being fashioned from one of the curiously embroidered silken covers appertaining to those glorious escutcheons, which, in England and elsewhere, are customarily hung up in some conspicuous place upon the dwellings of departed aristocracy. Sorry. Next to him, and at the right hand of the president, was a gentleman in long white hose and cotton drawers. His frame shook in a ridiculous manner with a fit of what Tarpaulin called the horrors. His jaws, which had been newly shaved, were tightly tied up by a bandage of muslin, and his arms being fastened in a similar way at the wrists, prevented him from helping himself too freely to the liquors upon the table, a precaution rendered necessary, in the opinion of Legs, by the peculiarly sottish and wine-bibbing cast of his visage. A pair of prodigious ears, nevertheless, which it was no doubt found impossible to confine, towered away into the atmosphere of the apartment, and were occasionally pricked up in a spasm at the sound of a drawing of a cork. Fronting him, sixthly and lastly, was situated a singularly stiff-looking personage who, being afflicted with paralysis, must, to speak seriously, have felt very ill at ease in his unaccommodating habiliments. He was habited somewhat uniquely in a new and handsome mahogany coffin, its top or headpiece pressed upon the skull of the wearer and extended over it in the fashions of a hood, giving to the entire face an air of indescribable interest. Armholes had been cut in the sides, for the sake of not more of elegance than of convenience, but the dress nevertheless prevented its proprietor from sitting as erect as his associates, and as he lay reclining against his trestle, at an angle of 45 degrees, a pair of huge goggle eyes rolled up their awful whites towards the ceiling, in absolute amazement at their own enormity. Before each of the party lay a portion of a skull, which was used as a drinking cup. Overhead was suspended a human skeleton by means of a rope tied round one of the legs and fastened to a ring in the ceiling. The other limb, confined by no such fetter, stuck off from the body at right angles, causing the whole loose and rattling flame to dangle and twirl about the caprice of every occasional puff of wind that found its way into the apartment. In the cranium of this hideous thing lay a quantity of ignited charcoal, which threw a fitful but vivid light over the entire scene, while coffins and other wares appertaining to the shop of an undertaker were piled high up around the room and against the windows, preventing any from escaping into the street. At sight of this extraordinary assembly and of their still more extraordinary paraphernalia, our two seamen did not conduct themselves with that degree of decorum which might have been expected. Legs, leaning against the wall near which he happened to be standing, dropped his lower jaw still lower than usual, and spread open his eyes to their fullest extent, while Hugh Tarpaulin stood down so as to bring his nose upon a level with the table, and spreading out a palm upon either knee, burst into a long, loud, and obstreperous roar of ill-timed and immoderate laughter. Without, however, taking offense at behavior so exceedingly rude, the tall president smiled very graciously upon the intruders, nodded to them in a dignified manner with his head of sable plumes, and arising, took each by an arm and led him to a seat which some of the others of the company had placed in the meantime for his accommodations. Legs to all this offered not the slightest resistance, but sat down as he was directed, while the gallant Hugh, removing his coffin trestle from its station near the head of the table, to the vicinity of the little consumptive lady in the winding sheet, plumped down by her side in a high glee, and pouring out a skull of red wine, quaffed it to their better acquaintance. But at this presumption, the stiff gentleman in the coffin seemed exceedingly nettled, and serious consequences might have ensued had the president, rapping upon the table with his truncheon, diverted the attention of all present to the following speech. "It becomes our duty upon the present happy occasion—" "Avast there!" interrupted Legs, looking very serious. Avast there, I say, and tell us who the devil ye all are, and what business ye have here, rigged off like the foul fiends, and swilling the snug blue ruin stowed away for the winter by my honest shipmate, Will Wimber the Undertaker. That certainly was a sentence. At this unpardonable piece of ill breeding, and the original company half started to their feet and uttered the same rapid succession of wild, fiendish shrieks which had before caught the attention of the seamen. The president, however, was the first to recover his composure, and at length, turning to Legs with great dignity, recommended, "Most willingly will we gratify any reasonable curiosity on part of the guests so illustrious, unbidden though they be. Know then that in these dominions I am monarch, and here rule with undivided empire under the title of King Pest the First. This apartment, which you had no doubt profanely supposed to be the shop of Will Wimble the Undertaker, a man whom we know not, and whose plebeian appellation has never before this night thwarted our royal ears. This apartment, I say, is the dais chamber of our palace, devoted to the councils of our kingdom and to other sacred and lofty purposes. The noble lady who sits opposite is Queen Pest, our serene consort. The other exalted personages whom you behold are all of our family, and wear the insignia of the blood royal under the respective titles of His Grace the Archduke Pestiferous, His Grace the Duke Pestilential, His Grace the Duke Tempest, and Her Serene Highness the Archduchess Anapest. As regards," continued he, "your demand of the business upon which we sit here in council might be pardoned for replying that it concerns, and concerns alone, our own private and regal interest, and is in no manner important to any than ourselves. But in consideration of those rights to which as guests and strangers you may feel yourself entitled, we will furthermore explain that we are here this night, prepared by deep research and accurate investigation to examine, analyze, and thoroughly determine the indefinable spirit, the incomprehensible qualities and nature of those inestimable treasures of the palate, the wines, ales, and liquors of this goodly metropolis. By so doing to advance not more than our designs than the true welfare of that unearthly sovereign whose reign is over us all, whose dominions are unlimited, and whose name is Death." "Whose name is Davy Jones!" ejaculated Tarpaulin, helping the lady to his side with a skull of liquor, and pouring out a second for himself. "Profane varlet," said the president, now turning his attention to the worthy Hugh. "Profane and execrable wretch. We have said that in consideration of those rights which even in thy filthy person we feel no inclination to violate, we have consented to make reply to thy rude and unseasonable inquiries. We nevertheless, for your unhallowed attempts upon intrusion upon our counsels, believe it our duty to mulct thee and thy companion in each a gallon of black strap, having imbibed which to the prosperity of our kingdom, at a single draught, and upon your bended knee, ye shall be forthwith free either to proceed upon your way, or remain and be admitted to the privileges of our table, according to your respective and individual pleasures." "It would be a matter of utter impossibility," replied Legs, whom the assumptions and dignity of King Pest I had evidently inspired some feelings of respect, and who arose and steadied himself by the table as he spoke. "It would please your majesty be a matter of utter impossibility to stow away in my hold even 1/4 part of the same liquor which your majesty just mentioned, to say nothing of the stuffs placed on board by the forenoon by way of ballast, and not to mention the various ales and liqueurs shipped this evening at different seaports. I have, at present, a full cargo of humming stuff, taken in and duly paid for at the sign of the Jolly Tar. You will therefore please your majesty be so good as to take the will for the deed, for by no manner of means either can I or will I swallow another drop, least of all a drop of that villainous bilge water that answers to the hail of black strap." "Belay that," interrupted Tarpaulin, astonished not more at the length of his companion's speeches than at the nature of his refusal. "Belay that, you lubber, and I say Legs, none of your palaver. My hull is still light, although I confess you yourself seem to be a little top-heavy. And as for the matter of your share of the cargo, why, rather than raise a squall, I would find stowage room for it myself, but—" "This proceeding," interposed the president, "is by no means in accordance with the terms of the mulct or sentence, which in its nature median, and not to be altered or recalled. The conditions we have imposed must be fulfilled to the letter, and that without a moment's hesitation, in failure of which fulfillment we decree that you do here be neck-tied and heels together, tied neck and heels together, and duly drowned as rebels in yon hogshead of October beer. A sentence, a righteous and just sentence, a glorious decree, a most worthy and upright and holy condemnation, shouted the pest family all together. The king elevated his forehead into innumerable wrinkles. The gouty little old man puffed like a pair of bellows. The lady of the winding sheet waved her nose to and fro. The gentleman in the cotton drawers pricked up his ears. She of the shroud gasped like a dying fish, and he of the coffin looked stiff and rolled up his eyes. chuckled Tarpaulin, without heeding the general excitation. I was saying, said he, I was saying when Mr. Pest poked in his marlin spike, that as for the matter of 2 or 3 gallons more or less of blackstrap, it was a trifle to a tight sea boat like myself, not overstowed. But when it comes to drinking the health of the devil, whom God aswalzi, and going down upon my marrow bones to his ill-favored majesty, there, whom I know, as well as I know myself, to be a sinner, to be nobody in the whole world but Tim Hurly-Gurly the stage player, why, it is quite another guess. It's quite another guess sort of a thing, and utterly and altogether past my comprehension. He was not allowed to finish this speech in tranquility. At the name Tim Hurly-Gurly, the whole assembly leapt from their seats. Treason! Shouted His Majesty, King Pest the First. Treason! Shouted the little man with the gout. Treason! Screamed the Archduchess Anna Pest. Treason! Muttered the gentleman with his jaws tied up. Treason! Growled he of the coffin. Treason! Treason! Shrieked Her Majesty of the Mouth, and seizing by the hinder part of his breeches the unfortunate Tarpaulin, who had just commenced pouring out for himself a skull of liquor, she lifted him high into the air and let him fall without ceremony into the huge open puncheon of his beloved ale. Bobbing up and down for a few seconds like an apple in a bowl of toddy, he, at length, finally disappeared amid the whirlpool of foam, which, in the already effervescent liquor, his struggles easily succeeded in creating. Not tamely, however, did the tall seaman behold the comfiture of his companion. Jostling King Pest through the open trap, the valiant leg slammed the door down upon him with an oath and strode towards the center of the room. Here, tearing down the skeleton which swung over the table, he laid it about him with so much energy and goodwill that, as the last glimpses of light died away within the apartment, he succeeded in knocking out the brains of the little gentleman with gout. Rushing them with all his force against the fatal hogshead full of October ale and Hugh Tarpaulin, he rolled it over and over in an instant. Out burst a deluge of liquor so fierce, so impetuous, so overwhelming that the room was flooded from wall to wall. The loaded table was overturned. The trestles were thrown upon their backs, the tub of punch into the fireplace, and the ladies into hysterics. Piles of death furniture floundered about. Jugs, pitchers, and carboys mingled promiscuously in the melee, and wicker flagons encountered desperately with bottles of junk. The man with the horrors was drowned upon the spot. The little stiff gentleman floated off in his coffin, and the victorious legs, seizing by the waist the fat lady in the shroud, rushed out with her into the street and made a beeline for the Free and Easy, followed under easy sail by the redoubtable Hugh Tarpaulin, and having sneezed 3 or 4 times, panted and puffed after him with the Archduchess of Anapest. What the hell was that? Yes, we encountered 6 people in death, and they tried to drown us in alcohol, but I fought them off and stole one of them to be my lady of the ship. Interesting. I know it was the word. Oh, no, Topi, you never have to apologize for leaving. Undertaker the restaurant. Yep, that is the name of Edgar Allan Poe. It's all weird. Cannot believe that took half an hour, huh? All right. A lot of treason, so much treason. What a way to go in alcohol. He was feeling no pain, at least. Also, welcome in, Holly. Jose Cuervo, you can die however you want, Holly. Who is anyone to stop you? That was very morbid, but it also feels very appropriate to Poe. Oh boy. I will do my best with this one. It's got a lot of words of languages that I do not speak. And we've learned how poorly I speak them because of French. You can't die. Immortal Paka? Ooh. I am but merely human. Mystification. Slid, if these be your pasados and montiantes, I'll have none of 'em. Ned Knowles. The Baron Ritzner von Jung was a noble Hungarian family, every member of which, at least as far back into antiquity as any certain records extend, was more or less remarkable for talent of some description. The majority for that species of grotesquerie in contemplation of which Tieck, a scion of the house, has given a vivid, although by no means the most vivid exemplifications. My acquaintance with Ritzner commenced at the magnificent Chateau Jung, into which a train of droll adventures, not to be made public, threw me during the summer months of the year 18. Here it was I obtained a place in his regard, and here, with somewhat more difficulty, a partial insight into his mental conformation. In later days this insight grew more clear, as the intimacy which had first permitted it became more close, and when, after 3 years of separation, we met at G-N, it's blanked out, but they gave us a G at the beginning and an N at the end, I knew all that it was necessary to know about the character of the Baron Ritzner von, I'm going to say Jung. I feel like it should be Jung. I remember the buzz of curiosity which his advent excited within the college precincts on the night of the 25th of June. I remember still more distinctly that he was pronounced by all parties at first sight the most remarkable man in the world. No person made any attempt at accounting for his opinion. That he was unique appeared so undeniable that it was deemed impertinent to inquire wherein the uniquity consisted. But letting this matter pass for the present, I will merely observe that from the first moment of his setting foot within the limits of the university, he began to exercise over the habits, manners, persons, purses, and propensities of the whole community which surrounded him, and influenced the most extensive and despotic, yet at the same time the most indefinite and altogether unaccountable. Thus, the brief period of his residence at the university forms an era in its annals, and was characterized by all classes of people pertaining to it or its dependencies as that very extraordinary epoch forming the denomination of the Baron Ritzner von Jung. Upon his advent to G-N, he sought me out in my apartments. He was then of no particular age, by which I mean it was impossible to form a guess respecting his age by any data personally afforded. He might have been 15 or 50, and was 21 years and 7 months. He was by no means a handsome man, perhaps the reverse. The contour of his face was somewhat angular and harsh. His forehead was lofty and very fair, his nose a snub, his eyes large, heavy, glassy, and meaningless. About the mouth there was to be more observed. The lips were gently protruded, and rested the one upon the other after such a fashion that it is impossible to conceive any, even the most complex, combination of human features conveying so entirely and so singly the idea of unmitigated gravity, solemnity, and repose. It will be perceived, no doubt, from what I have already said, that the Baron was one of those human anomalies now and then to be found, who make the science of mystification the study and business of their lives. For this science a peculiar turn of mind gave him instinctively the cue, while his physical appearance afforded him unusual facilities for carrying his prospects into effect. I firmly believe that no student at G-N during that renowned epoch so quaintly termed the dominion of the Baron Ritzner von Jung ever rightly entered into the mystery which overshadowed his character. I truly think that no person at the university, with the exception of myself, ever suspected him to be capable of a joke, verbal or practical. The old bulldog at the garden gate would have sooner been accused. The ghost of Heraclitus, or the wig of the emeritus professor of theology. This, too, when it was evident that the most egregious and unpardonable of all conceivable tricks, whimsicalities, and buffooneries were brought about, if not directly by him, at least plainly through his intermediate agency or connivance. The beauty, if I may so call it, of his art mystique lay in that consummate ability, resulting from an almost intuitive knowledge of human nature and a most wonderful self-possession, by means of which he never failed to make it appear that the drolleries he was occupied in bringing to a point arose partly in spite and partly in consequence of the laudable efforts he was making for their prevention, and for the preservation of the good order and dignity of Alma Mater. The deep, the poignant, the overwhelming mortification which upon each failure of his praiseworthy endeavors would suffuse every lineament of his countenance left not the slightest room for doubt of his sincerity in the bosoms of even his most skeptical companions. The adroitness, too, was no less worthy of observation, by which he contrived to shift the sense of the grotesque from the creator to the created, from his own person to the absurdities to which he had given rise. In no instance before that of which I speak have I known the habitual mystique to escape the natural consequences of his maneuvers, an attachment of the ludicrous to his own character and person. Continually enveloped in an atmosphere of whim, my friend appeared to live only for the severities of society, and not even his own household have for a moment associated other ideas than those of the rigid and august with the memory of the Baron Ritzner von Jung. During the epoch of his residence at G-N, it really appeared that the demon of the dolce far niente lay like an incubus upon the university. Nothing at least was done beyond eating and drinking and merrymaking. The apartments of the students were converted into so many pothouses, and there was no pothouse of them all more famous or more frequented than that of the Baron. Our carousals here were many and boisterous and long, and never unfruitful of events. Upon one occasion we had protracted our sitting nearly until daybreak, and an unusual quantity of wine had been drunk. The company consisted of 7 or 8 individuals beside the Baron and myself. Most of these were young men of wealth, of high connection, of great family pride, and all alive with an exaggerated sense of honor. They abounded in the most ultra-German opinions respecting the duello. To these quixotic notions, some recent Parisian publications backed by 3 or 4 desperate and fatal rencontres at the college had given new vigor and impulse, and thus the conversation during the greater part of the night had run wild upon the all-engrossing topic of the times. The Baron, who had been unusually silent and abstracted in the earlier portion of the evening, at length seemed to be aroused from his apathy, took a leading part in the discourse, and dwelt upon the benefits, and more especially upon the beauties, of the received code of etiquette and passages of arms with an ardor and eloquence, an impressiveness, and an affectionateness of manner, which elicited the warmest enthusiasm from his hearers in general, and absolutely staggered even myself, who well knew him to be at heart a ridiculer of those very points for which he had contended, and especially to hold the entire fanfaronade of dueling etiquette in the sovereign contempt which it deserves. Looking around me during a pause in the Baron's discourse, of which my readers may gather some faint idea when I say that it bore resemblance to the fervid, chanting, monotonous, yet musical sermonic manner of Coleridge, I perceived symptoms of even more than the general interest in the countenance of one of the party. This gentleman, whom I shall call Hermann, was an original in every respect, except perhaps in the single particular that he was a very great fool. He contrived to bear, however, among a particular set at the university, a reputation for deep metaphysical thinking, and I believe for some logical talent. As a duelist, he had acquired great renown, even at G-N. I forget the precise number of victims who had fallen at his hands, but they were many. He was a man of courage, undoubtedly, but it was upon his minute acquaintance with the etiquette of the duello and the nicety of his sense of honor that he most especially prided himself. These things were a hobby which he rode to the death. To Ritzner, ever upon the lookout for the grotesque, his peculiarities had for a long time past afforded food for mystification. Of this, however, I was not aware, although in the present instance I saw clearly that something of a whimsical nature was upon the tapis with my friend, and that Hermann was its especial object. As the former proceeded in his discourse, or rather monologue, I perceived the excitement of the latter momently increasing. At length he spoke, offering some objection to a point which insisted upon by R, and giving his reasons in detail. To these the Baron replied at length, still maintaining his exaggerated tone of sentiment, and concluding, in what I thought very bad taste, with a sarcasm and a sneer. The hobby of Herman now took the bit in his teeth. This I could discern by the studied, hair-splitting farrago of his rejoinder. His last words I distinctly remember. Your opinions, allow me to say, Baron von Jung, although in the main correct, are, in many nice points, discreditable to yourself and to the university of which you are a member. In a few respects, they are even unworthy of serious refutation. I would say more than this, sir, were it not for the fear of giving you offense. Here the speaker smiled blandly. I would say, sir, that your opinions are not the opinions to be expected of a gentleman. As Herman completed this equivocal sentence, all eyes were turned upon the Baron. He became pale, then excessively red. Then, dropping his pocket handkerchief, stooped to recover it, when I saw a glimpse of his countenance, while it could be seen by no one else at the table. It was radiant with the quizzical expressions which was its natural character, but which I had never seen it assume except when we were alone together, and when he unbent himself freely. In an instant afterward he stood erect, confronting Herman, and so total an alteration of countenance in so short a period I certainly never saw before. For a moment I even fancied that I had misconceived him, and that he was in sober earnest. He appeared to be stifling with passion, and his face was cadaverously white. For a short time he remained silent, appearing striving to master his emotion. Having at length seemingly succeeded, he reached a decanter which stood near him, saying, as he held it firmly clenched, The language you thought proper to employ, Mynheer Herman, in addressing yourself to me is objectionable in so many particulars that I have neither temper nor time for specification. That my opinions, however, are not the opinions to be expected from a gentleman is an observation so directly offensive as to allow me but one line of conduct. Conduct. Where did I stop? Some courtesy, nevertheless, is due to the presence of this company and to yourself at this moment as my guest. You will then pardon me, therefore, if upon this consideration I deviate slightly from the general usage among gentlemen in similar cases of personal affront. You will forgive me for the moderate task I shall make upon your imagination, and endeavor to consider, for an instance, the reflection of your person in yonder mirror as the living Mynheer Herman himself. This being done, there will be no difficulty whatsoever. I shall discharge this decanter of wine at your image in yonder mirror, and thus fulfill all the spirit, if not the exact letter, of resentment for your insult, while the necessity of physical violence to your real person will be obviated. With these words, he hurled the decanter full of wine against the mirror which hung directly opposite Herman, striking the reflection of his person with a great precision, and of course shattering the glass into fragments. The whole company at once started to their feet, with the exception of myself and Ritzner, took their departure. As Herman went out, the Baron whispered to me that I should follow him and make an offer of my services. To this I agreed, not knowing precisely what to make of so ridiculous a piece of business. The duelists accepted my aid with his stiff and ultra-recher air, and taking my arm led me to his apartment. I could hardly forbear laughing in his face while he proceeded to discuss with the profoundest gravity which he termed the refinedly peculiar character of the insult he had received. After a tiresome harangue in his ordinary style, he took down from his bookshelves a number of musty volumes on the subject of the duello, and entertained me for a long time with their contents, reading aloud and commenting earnestly as he read. I can just remember the titles of some of the works. There were the Ordonnance of Philippe le Bel on single combat, the Theatre of Honor by Favin, a treatise on the permission of duel by Audigier. He displayed also with much pomposity Brantôme's Memoirs of Duels, published at Cologne in 1666, in the types of Elzevir, a precious and unique vellum paper volume with a fine margin, and bound by Derome. But he requested my attention particularly, and with an air of mysterious sagacity, to a thick octavo, written in barbarous Latin by one Hedelin, a Frenchman, and having the quaint title, De Lille Scripta et non Alterique. From this, he read to me one of the drollest chapters in the world concerning injure per applicatum applicationem per constructionem et per se, about half of which he averred was strictly applicable to his own refinedly peculiar case, although not one syllable of the whole matter could I understand for the life of me. Having finished the chapter, he closed the book and demanded what I thought to be necessary to be done. I replied that I had entire confidence in his superior delicacy of feeling and would abide by what he proposed. With this answer, he seemed flattered and sat down to write a note to the Baron. It ran thus: Sir, my friend Mr. P will hand you this note. I find it incumbent upon me to request at your earliest convenience an explanation of this evening's occurrences at your chamber. In the event of your declining this request, Mr. P will be happy to arrange with any friend whom you may appoint the steps preliminary to a meeting. With sentiments of perfect respect, your most humble servant, Johann Hermann. To the Baron Ritzner von Jung, August 18th, 18 blank. Not knowing what better to do, I called upon Ritzner with this epistle. He bowed as I presented it, then, with a grave countenance, motioned me to a seat. Having perused the cartel, he wrote the following reply, which I carried to Hermann. Sir, through our common friend Mr. P, I have received your note of this evening. Upon due reflection, I frankly admit the propriety of the explanation you suggest. This being admitted, I still find great difficulty, owing to the refinedly peculiar nature of our disagreement and the personal affront offered on my part, in so wording what I have to say by way of apology, as to meet all the minute exigencies, and the variable shadows of the case. I have great reliance, however, on the extreme delicacy of discrimination in matters appertaining to the rules of etiquette, for which you have been so long and so preeminently distinguished. With perfect certainty of my own, to refer you to the opinions of Sieur Heidelin, as set forth in the 9th paragraph of the chapter, Injure per applicationem per constructionem et per se, in his Duelli lex scripta et non alterique. The nicety of your discernment in all the matters here treated will be sufficient, I am assured, to convince you that the mere circumstance of me referring to you this admirable passage ought to satisfy your request as a man of honor for explanation. With sentiments of profound respect, your most obedient servant, von Jung. To the heir, Johann Hermann, August 18th, 18 blank. Hermann commenced the perusal of this epistle with a scowl, which, however, was converted to a smile of the most ludicrous self-complacency as he came to the rigmarole about injure per applicationem per constructionem et per se. Having finished reading, he begged me, with the blandest of all possible smiles, to be seated while he made reference to the treatise in question. Turning to the passage he specified, he read it with great care to himself, then closed the book, and desired me, in my character of confidential acquaintance, to express to the Baron von Jung his exalted sense of chivalrous behavior, and, in that of second, to assure him that the explanation offered was of the fullest, the most honorable, and the most unequivocally satisfactory nature. Somewhat amazed at all this, I made my retreat to the Baron. He seemed to receive Hermann's amicable letter as a matter of course, and after a few words of general conversation, went to an inner room and brought out the everlasting treatise, Duelli lex scripta et non alterique. He handed me the volume and asked me to look over some portion of it. I did so, but to little purpose, not being able to gather the least particle of meaning. He then took the book himself and read me a chapter out loud. To my surprise, what he read proved to be a most horribly absurd account of a duel between two baboons. He now explained the mystery, showing that the volume, as it appeared prima facie, was written upon the plan of the nonsense verses of Du Bartas. That is to say, the language was ingeniously framed so as to present to the ear all outward signs of intelligibility, and even of profundity, while in fact not a shadow of meaning existed. The key to the whole was found in leaving out every second and third word alternately, when there appeared a series of ludicrous quizzes upon a single combat, as practiced in modern times. The Baron afterward informed me that he had purposely thrown the treatise in Hermann's way 2 or 3 weeks before the adventure, and that he was satisfied from the general tenor of his conversation that he had studied it with the deepest attention and firmly believed it to be a work of unusual merit. Upon this hint, he proceeded. Herman would have died 1,000 deaths rather than acknowledge his inability to understand anything and everything in the universe that had ever been written about the duello. Littleton Barry. Interesting. I'll get some water and be right back. Welcome in El Perito. Welcome in Trust Me, Inochi. Thank you for staying around, Reeb. I'm gonna get some water. I'll be back. I swear, if YouTube managed to get redeems in order, like, there would be no question. It would be so fun. Oh, my ear is itchy. I think I've got 1 or 2 more in me. Maybe 1. I'm getting exceedingly tongue-tied today. I don't know why. And the one after is very, very long. So maybe I'll do 1 more. We'll go a shorter stream. Somebody is making something that can fix that. Might have to relook. Ooh. Fun. Playing a game while you listen, and that's fun. I'm glad you're occupying your time. Glad I can be there to accompany it. Yeah, we'll go through this 1 more because I keep getting tongue-tied. YouTube had redeems, we could have the purr. Poor Frankie. You get it sometimes. That's enough, right? All right, 1 last story for tonight. Lygia? That's how I'm going to pronounce it. Not sure that's how it's pronounced, but it's what I will say. Lygia. And the will therein lieth, which dieth not, who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigor. For God is but a great will pervading all things by nature of its intentness. Man doth not yield himself to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. Joseph Glanville. I cannot for my soul remember how, when, or even precisely where I first became acquainted with the Lady Lygia. Long years have since elapsed, and my memory is feeble through much suffering. Or perhaps I cannot now bring these points to mind, because in truth, the character of my beloved, her rare learning, her singular yet placid cast of beauty, and the thrilling and enthralling eloquence of her low musical language made their way into my heart by paces so steadily and stealthily progressive that they have been unnoticed and unknown. Yet I believe that I met her first and most frequently in some large, old, decaying city near the Rhine. Of her family, I have surely heard her speak. That it is of remotely ancient date cannot be doubted. Lygia, buried in studies of a nature more than all else adapted to deadened impressions of the outward world, it is by that sweet word alone, by Lygia, that I bring before mine eyes and fancy the image of her who is no more. And now, while I write, a recollection flashes upon me that I have never known the paternal name of her who was my friend and my betrothed, and who became my partner of my studies, and finally the wife of my bosom. Was it a playful charge on the part of my Lygia, or was it a test of my strength of affection that I should institute no inquiries upon this point? Or was it rather a caprice of my own, a wildly romantic offering on the shrine of the most passionate devotion? I but indistinctly recall the fact itself. What wonder that I have utterly forgotten the circumstances which originated or attended it, and indeed if that spirit which is entitled romance, if ever she, the wan and misty-angeled Ashtafet of idolatrous Egypt, presided, as they tell, over marriages ill-omened, then most surely she presided over mine. There is one dear topic, however, on which my memory fails me not. It is the person of Lygia. In stature she was tall, somewhat slender, and in her latter days even emaciated. I would in vain attempt to portray the majesty, the quiet ease of her demeanor, the incomprehensible lightness and elasticity of her footfall. She came and departed as a shadow. I was never made aware of her entrance into my closed study save by the dear music of her low, sweet voice as she placed her marble hand upon my shoulder. In beauty of face, no maiden ever equaled her. It was the radiance of an opium dream, an airy and spirit-lifting vision more wildly divine than the fantasies which hovered vision about the slumbering souls of the daughters of Delos. Yet her features were not of that regular mold which we have been falsely taught to worship in the classical labors of the heathen. There is no exquisite beauty, says Bacon, Lord Verulam, speaking truly of the forms and genre of beauty, without some strangeness in the proportion. Yet although I saw that the features of Ligeia were not of her classic regularity, although I perceived that her loveliness was indeed exquisite, and felt that there was much of strangeness pervading it, yet have I tried in vain to detect the irregularity, and to trace home my own perception of the strange. I examined the contour of the lofty and paled forehead. It was faultless. How cold indeed that word when applied to a majesty so divine. The skin rivaling the purest ivory, the commanding extent and repose, the gentle prominence of the regions above the temples, and that the raven black, the glossy, the luxuriant, the naturally curling tresses, setting forth the full force of the Homeric epithet, hyacinth. I looked at the delicate outlines of the nose, and nowhere but in the graceful medallions of the Hebrews had I beheld a similar perfection. They were the same luxurious smoothness of the surface, the same scarcely perceptible tendency to the aquiline, the same harmoniously curved nostrils speaking the free spirit. I regarded the sweet mouth. Herein was indeed the triumph of all things heavenly, the magnificent turn of the short upper lip, the soft voluptuous slumber of the under, the dimples which sported and the colors which spoke, the teeth glancing back with a brilliancy almost startling, every ray of the holy light which fell upon them in her serene and placid, yet most exultingly radiant of all smiles. I scrutinized the formation of the chin, and here too I found the gentleness of breadth, the softness and the majesty, the fullness and the spirituality of the Greek, the contour which the god Apollo revealed but in a dream to Cleomenes, the son of the Athenian, and then I peered into the large eyes of Ligeia. Man, this guy is down bad. For eyes we have no models in the remotely antique. It might have been, too, that in these eyes of my beloved lay the secret to which Lord Verulam alludes. They were, I must believe, far larger than the ordinary eyes of our own race. They were even fuller than the fullest of the gazelle eyes of the tribe of the valley of Nourjahad. Yet it was only in intervals, in moments of intense excitement, that this peculiarity became more than slightly noticeable in Ligeia. And at such moments was her beauty, in my heated fancy thus it appeared perhaps, the beauty of beings either above or apart from the earth, the beauty of the fabulous houri of the Turk. The hue of the orbs was of the most brilliant black, and far over them hung jetty lashes of great length. The brows, slightly irregular in outline, had the same tint. The strangeness, however, which I found in the eyes, was of a nature distinct from the formation, or the color, or the brilliancy of the features, and must, after all, be referred to the expression. A word of no meaning, behind whose vast latitude of mere sound we entrench our ignorance of so much of the spiritual. The expression of the eyes of Ligeia. How for long hours have I pondered upon it. How have I, through the whole of a midsummer night, struggled to fathom it. What was it? That something more profound of the well of Democritus, which lay far within the pupils of my beloved. What was it? I was possessed by a passion to discover. Those eyes, those large, those shining, those divine orbs. Sorry, fanfiction flashbacks. Those divine orbs. They became to me the twin stars of Leda, and to them I the devoutest of astrologers. There is no point among the many incomprehensible anomalies of the science of mind more thrillingly excited than the fact, never, I believe, noticed in the schools, that in our endeavors to recall to memory something long forgotten, we often find ourselves upon the very verge of remembrance, without being able, in the end, to remember. And thus how frequently in my intense scrutiny of Ligeia's eyes have I felt approaching the full knowledge of their expression, felt it approaching, yet not quite be mine, and so at length entirely depart. And strange, oh strangest mystery of all, I found in the commonest objects of the universe a circle of analogies to that expression. I mean to say that, subsequently to the period when Lygia's beauty passed into my spirit, there dwelling as in a shrine, I derived, from my many existences in the material world, a sentiment such as I always felt aroused within me by her large and luminous orbs. Yet not the more could I define the sentiment, or analyze, or even steadily view it. I recognized, let me repeat, sometimes in the survey of a rapidly growing vine, in the contemplation of a moth, a butterfly, a chrysalis, a stream of running water. I have felt it in the ocean, in the falling of a meteor. I have felt it in the glances of unusually aged people. And there are one or two stars in heaven, one especially a star of the 6th magnitude, double and changeable, to be found near the large star in Lyra, in a telescopic scrutiny of which I have been made aware of the feeling. I have been filled with it by certain sounds from stringed instruments, and not unfrequently by passages from books. Among innumerable other instances, I will remember something in a volume of Joseph Glanville, which, perhaps merely from its quaintness, who shall never say, never failed to inspire me with the sentiment. And the will therein lieth which dieth not, who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigor. For God is but a great will pervading all things by nature of its intentness. Man doth not yield him to the angel, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will. Length of years and subsequent reflection have enabled me to trace, indeed, some remote connection between this passage in the English moralist and a portion of the character of Ligeia. An intensity in thought, action, or speech was possibly in her, a result, or at least an index, of that gigantic volition which during our long intercourse failed to give other and more immediate evidence of its existence. Of all the women whom I have ever known, she, the outwardly calm, the ever-placid Ligeia, was the most violently a prey to the tumultuous vultures of stern passion. And of such passion I could form no estimate, save by the miraculous expansion of the eyes, which at once so delighted and appalled me, by the almost magical melody, modulation, distinctness, and placidity of her very low voice, and by the fierce energy, rendered doubly effective by contrast with her matter of utterance, of the wild words which she habitually uttered. I have spoken of the learning of Ligeia. It was immense, such as I have never known in women. In the classical tongues, she was deeply proficient, and as far as my own acquaintance extended in regard to the modern dialects of Europe, I have never known her at fault. Indeed, upon any theme of the most admired, because simply the most abstruse of the boasted erudition of the Academy, have I ever found Ligeia at fault. How singularly, how thrillingly this one point in the nature of my wife has forced itself, at this late period only, upon my attention. I said her knowledge was such as I have never known in woman, but here breathes the man who has traversed, and successfully, all the wide areas of the moral, physical, and mathematical science. I saw not then what I now clearly perceive, that the acquisitions of Ligeia were gigantic, were astounding, yet I was sufficiently aware of her infinite supremacy to resign myself, with a childlike confidence, to her guidance through the chaotic world of metaphysical investigation, in which I was most busily occupied during the earlier years of our marriage. With how vast a triumph, with how vivid a delight, with how much of all that is ethereal in hope did I feel, as she bent over me in studies but little sought, but less known, that delicious vista by slow degrees expanding before me, down whose long, gorgeous, and all untrodden paths I might at length pass onward to a goal of wisdom too divinely precious not to be forbidden. How poignant, then, must have been the grief with which, after some years, I beheld my well-grounded expectations take wings to themselves and fly. Without Ligeia, I was but a child groping benighted. Her presence, her readings alone, rendered vividly luminous the many mysteries of the transcendentalism in which we were immersed. Wanting the radiant luster of her eyes, letters, lambent and golden, grew duller than Saturnian lead, and now whose eyes shone less and less frequently upon the pages over which I pored, Ligeia grew ill. The wild eyes blazed with a too glorious effulgence. The pale fingers became of the transparent waxen hue of the grave, and the blue veins upon the lofty forehead swelled and sank impetuously with the tides of the most gentle emotion. I saw that she must die, and I struggled desperately in vain with the grim Azrael, and the struggles of the passionate wife were to my astonishment even more energetic than my own. There had been much in her stern nature to impress me with the belief that, to her, death would have come without its terrors, but not so. Words are impotent to convey any idea of the fierceness of resistance with which she wrestled with the shadows. Shadow. I groaned in anguish at the pitiable spectacle. I would have soothed, I would have reasoned, but in the intensity of her wild desire for life, but for life, solace and reason were alike the utmost folly. Yet not until the last instance, amid the most convulsive writhings of her fierce spirit, were shaken the eternal placidity of her demeanor. Her voice grew more gentle, grew more low, yet I would not wish to dwell upon the wild meaning of the quietly uttered words. My brain reeled as I hearkened, entranced to a melody more than mortal, to assumptions and aspirations which mortality had never before known. That she loved me I should not have doubted, and I might have been easily aware that, in a bosom such as hers, love would have reigned no ordinary passion. But in death only was I fully impressed with the strength of her affection. For long hours detaining my hand, would she pour out before me the overflowing of a heart whose more than passionate devotion amounted to idolatry. How had I deserved to be so blessed by such confessions? How had I deserved to be so cursed with the removal of my beloved in the late hour of her making them? But upon this subject I cannot bear to dilate. Let me say only that in Lygia's more than womanly abandonment to a love, alas, all unmerited, all unworthily bestowed, I at length recognized the principle of her longing with so wildly earnest a desire for the life which was now fleeting so rapidly away. It is this wild longing, it is this eager vehemence for desire for life, but for life, that I have no power to portray, no utterance capable of expressing. At high noon on the night on which she departed, beckoning me peremptorily to her side, she bade me repeat certain verses composed by herself not many days before. I obeyed her. They were these. Lo, 'tis a gala night within the lonesome latter years, an angel throng bewinged, bedight in veils and drowned in tears, sit in a theater to see a play of hopes and fears, while the orchestra breathes fitfully the music of the spheres. Mimes in the form of God on high mutter and mumble low, and hither and thither fly, mere puppets they who come and go, at bidding of vast formless things that shift the scenery to and fro, flapping out from their condor wings, invisible woe. That motley drama, oh be sure, it shall not be forgot, with its phantom chased forevermore by a crowd that sees it not, through a circle that ever returneth into the same spot, and much of madness and more of sin, and horror the soul of plot. But see amid the mimic rout, a crawling shape intrude, a blood-red thing that writhes from out the scenic solitude. It writhes with mortal pangs, the mimes become its food, and the seraphs sob at vermin fangs in human gore imbued. Out are the lights, out all, and over each quivering form, the curtain, a funeral pall, comes down with the rush of a storm, and the angels all pallid and wan, uprising, unveiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy man, and its hero the conqueror worm. "Oh God!" half-shrieked Lygia, leaping to her feet and extending her arms aloft with a spasmodic motion as I made an end to these lines. "Oh God! Oh Divine Father! Shall these things be undeviatingly so? Shall this conqueror be not once conquered? Are we not part and parcel in thee? Who knoweth the mysteries and with the will, with its vigor, man doth not yield him to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will." And now, as if exhausted with emotion, she suffered her white arms to fall and returned solemnly to her bed of death. And as she breathed her last sighs, there came mingled with them a low murmur from her lips. I bent to them my ear and distinguished again the concluding words of the passage in Glanville. "Man doth not yield him to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will." She died, and I, crushed to the very dust with sorrow, could no longer endure the lonely desolation of my dwelling in the dim and decaying city by the Rhine. I had no lack of what the world calls wealth. Lygia had brought me far more than ordinary falls to the lot of mortals. After a few months, therefore, of weary and aimlessly wandering, I purchased and put in some repair an abbey, which I shall not name, in one of the wildest and least frequented portions of fair England. The gloomy and dreary grandeur of the building, the almost savage aspect of the domain, the many melancholy and time-honored memories connected with both, had much in unison with the feelings of utter abandonment which had driven me to that remote and unsocial region of the country. Yet although the external abbey, with its verdant decay hanging about it, suffered but little alteration, I gave way with a childlike perversity, and perchance with a faint hope of alleviating my sorrows, to a display of more than regal magnificence within. For such follies, even in childhood, I had imbibed a taste, and now they came back to me as if in the dotage of grief. Alas, I feel how much of even incipient madness might have been discovered in the gorgeous and fantastic draperies, in the solemn carvings of Egypt, in the wild cornices and furniture, and the bedlam patterns of the carpets of tufted gold. I had become a bounden slave in the trammels of opium, and my labors, my ordeals, had taken a colouring from my dreams. But these absurdities I must not pause to detail. Let me speak only of that one chamber, ever accursed, whither, in a moment of mental alienation, I led from the altar as my bride, as the successor of the forgotten Lygia, the fair-haired and blue-haired Lady Rowena Trevinian of Tremaine. There is no individual portion of the architecture and decoration of that bridal chamber which is now not visibly before me. Where were the souls of the haughty family of the bride when, through thirst of gold, they permitted to pass the threshold of an apartment so bedecked, a maiden and a daughter so beloved? I have said that I minutely remember the details of the chamber, yet I am sadly forgetful on topics of deep moment. And here there was no system, no keeping in the fantastic display to take hold upon the memory. The room lay in a high turret of the castellated abbey, was pentagonal in shape and of a capricious size. Occupying the whole southern face of the Pentagon was the sole window, an immense sheet of unbroken glass from Venice, a single pane and tinted of a leaden hue, so that rays of either the sun or moon passing through it fell with a ghastly luster on the objects within. Over the upper portion of this huge window extended the trellis work of an aged vine, which clambered up the massive walls of the turret. The ceiling, of a gloomy-looking oak, was excessively lofty, vaulted, and elaborately fretted with the wildest and most grotesque specimens of a semi-Gothic and semi-Druidical device. From out the most central recess of this melancholy vaulting depended, by a single chain of gold with long links, a huge censer of the same metal, Saracenic in pattern, and with many perforations so contrived that there writhed in and out of them, as if endued with a serpent vitality, a continual succession of parti-colored fires. We still got quite a ways to go. Some few ottomans and golden candelabra of Eastern figure were in various stations about, and there was the couch, too, the bridal couch of an Indian model, and low and sculptured of solid ebony, with a pall-like canopy above. In each of the angles of the chamber stood on a gigantic sarcophagus of black granite from the tombs of the kings over against Luxor, with their aged lids full of immemorial sculpture. But in the draping of the department lay, alas, the chief fantasy of all. The lofty walls, gigantic in height, even unproportionately so, were hung from summit to foot in vast folds with a heavy and massive-looking tapestry. Tapestry of a material which was found alike as a carpet on the floor and a covering for the ottomans and the ebony bed, as a canopy for the bed, and as the gorgeous volutes of the curtains which partially shaded the windows. The material was the richest cloth of gold. It was spotted all over at irregular intervals with arabesque figures about a foot in diameter, and wrought upon the cloth in patterns of the most jetty black. But these figures partook of the true character of the arabesque only when regarded from a certain single point of view. By a contrivance now common and indeed traceable to a very remote period of antiquity, they were made changeable in aspect. To one entering the room they bore the appearance of simple monstrosities, but upon a farther advance this appearance gradually departed, and step by step as the visitor moved his station in the chamber, he saw himself surrounded by an endless succession of the ghastly forms which belonged to the superstition of the Norman, or arise in the guilty slumbers of the monk. The phantasmagoric effect was vastly heightened by the artificial introduction of a strong continual current of wind behind the draperies, giving a hideous and uneasy animation to the whole. In halls such as these, in a bridal chamber such as this, I passed with the Lady of Tremaine the unhallowed hours of the first month of our marriage. Passed them with but little disquietude. That my wife dreaded the fierce moodiness of my temper, that she shunned me and loved me but little, I could not help perceiving. But it gave me rather pleasure than otherwise. I loathed her with a hatred belonging more to a demon than man. My memory flew back, oh, with what intensity of regret, to Ligeia, the beloved, the august, the beautiful, the entombed. I reveled in recollections of her purity, of her wisdom, of her lofty, her ethereal nature, of her passionate, her idolatrous love. Now then did my spirit fully and freely burn with more than all the fires of her own. And the excitement of my opium dreams, for which I was habitually fettered in the shackles of the drug, I would call aloud upon her name during the silence of the night, or among the sheltered recesses of the glens by day, as if, through the wild eagerness, the solemn passion, the consuming ardor of my longing for the departed, I could restore her to the pathway she had abandoned. Could it be forever? Upon the earth. About the commencement of the second month of the marriage, the Lady Rowena was attacked with a sudden illness from which her recovery was slow. The fever which consumed her rendered her nights uneasy, and her perturbed state of half-slumber, she spoke of sounds and of motions in and about the chamber of the turret, which I concluded had no origin save in the distemper of her fancy, or perhaps in the phantasmagoric influences of the chamber itself. She became at last convalescent, finally well. But a brief period elapsed ere a second more violent disorder threw her again upon the bed of suffering, and from this attack her frame, at all times feeble, never altogether recovered. Her illnesses were, after this epoch, of alarming character, and of more alarming reoccurrence, defying alike the knowledge and the great exertions of her physicians. With the increase of the chronic disease, which had thus apparently taken too sure hold upon her constitution to be eradicated by human means, I could not fail to observe a similar increase in the nervous irritation of her temperament, and in her excitability by trivial causes of fear. She spoke again, and now more frequently and pertinaciously of the sounds, of the slight sounds, and of the unusual motions upon the tapestries to which she had formerly alluded. One night, near the closing in of September, she pressed this distressing subject with more than usual emphasis upon my attention. She had just awakened from an unquiet slumber, and I had been watching with feelings of half anxiety, half of vague terror, the workings of her emaciated countenance. I sat by the side of her ebony bed upon one of the ottomans of India. She partly rose and spoke in a low, earnest whisper of sounds she had then heard, but which I could not hear, of motions which she then saw, but which I could not perceive. The wind was rushing hurriedly behind the tapestries, and I wished to show her what, let me confess it, I could not all believe, that these almost inarticulate breathings, and those of gentle variations upon the figures upon the wall, were but of the natural effects of that customary rushing of the wind. But a deathly pallor, overspreading her face, had proved to me that my exertions to reassure her would be fruitless. She appeared to be fainting, and no attendants were within call. I remembered where was deposited a decanter of light wine which had been ordered by her physicians, and hastened across the chamber to procure it. But as I stepped beneath the light of the censer, two circumstances of a startling nature attracted my attention. I had felt that some palpable, although invisible object had passed lightly by my person, and I saw that there lay upon the golden carpet in the very middle of the rich luster thrown from the censer a faint, indefinite shadow of angelic aspect, such as might be fancied for the shadow of a shade. But I was wild with the excitement of an immoderate dose of opium, and heeded these things but little, nor spoke of them to Rowena. Having found the wine, I recrossed the chamber and poured out a gobletful, which I held to the lips of the fainting lady. She had now partially recovered, however, and took the vessel herself, while I sank upon an ottoman near me with my eyes fastened upon her person. It was then that I became distinctly aware of a gentle footfall upon the carpet, and near the couch, and a second thereafter, as Rowena was in the act of raising the wine to her lips, I saw, or may have dreamed that I saw, fall within the goblet, as if some invisible spring in the atmosphere of the room, 3 or 4 large drops of a brilliant and ruby-colored fluid. If this I saw, not so Rowena. She swallowed the wine unhesitatingly, and I forebode to speak to her of a circumstance which must, after all, I considered have been but the suggestion of a vivid imagination, rendered morbidly active by the terror of the lady, by the opium, and by the hour. Yet I cannot conceal it from my own perception that immediately subsequent to the fall of the ruby drops, a rapid change for the worse took place in the disorder of my wife, so that on the 3rd subsequent night, the hands of her menials prepared her for the tomb, and on the 4th I sat alone with her shrouded body in that fantastic chamber which I had received her as my bride. Wild visions, opium engendered, flitted like shadows before me. I gazed with unquiet eye upon the sarcophagi in the angles of the room, upon the varying figures of the drapery, and upon the writings of the party-colored flames in the censer ahead. My eyes then fell, as I called to mind the circumstances of a former night, to the spot beneath the glare of the censer where I had seen the faint traces of the shadow. It was there, however, no longer, and breathing with greater freedom, I turned my glances to the pallid and rigid figure upon the bed. Then rushed upon me 1,000 memories of Ligeia, and then came back upon my heart with the turbulent violence of a flood, a whole of that unutterable woe which I had regarded her thus enshrouded. The night waned, and still, with a bosom full of bitter thoughts of the one and only, supremely beloved, I remained gazing upon the body of Rowena. It might have been midnight, or perhaps earlier, or later, for I had taken no note of time, when a sob, low, gentle, but very distinct, startled me from my reverie. I felt that it came from the bed of ebony, the bed of death. I listened in an agony of superstitious terror, but there was no repetition of the sound. I strained my vision to detect any motion in the corpse, but there was not the slightest perceptible. Yet I could not have been deceived. I had heard the noise, however faint, and my soul was awakened within me. I resolutely and perseveringly kept my attention riveted upon the body. Many minutes elapsed before any circumstance occurred tending to throw light upon the mystery. At length it became evident that a slight, a very feeble, and barely unnoticeable tinge of color had flushed up within the cheeks, and along the sunken small veins of the eyelids. Through a species of unutterable horror and awe, for which the language of mortality has no sufficiently energetic expression, I felt my heart cease to beat, my limbs grow rigid where I sat. Yet a sense of duty finally operated to restore my self-possession. I could no longer doubt that we had been precipitate in our preparations, that Rowena still lived. It was necessary that some immediate exertion be made, yet the turret was altogether apart from the portion of the abbey tenanted by the servants. There were none within call. I had no means of summoning them to my aid without leaving the room for many minutes, and this I could not venture to do. I therefore struggled alone in my endeavors to call back the spirit ill hovering. In a short period it was certain, however, that a relapse had taken place. The color disappeared from both eyelid and cheek, leaving a wanness even more than that of marble. The lips became doubly shriveled and pinched up in the ghastly expression of death. A repulsive clamminess and coldness overspread rapidly the surface of the body, and all the usual rigorous stiffness immediately supervened. I fell back with a shudder upon the couch from which I had been so startlingly aroused, and again gave myself up to passionate waking visions of Ligeia. An hour thus elapsed when, could it be possible? I was a second time aware of some vague sound issuing from the region of the bed. I listened in extremity of horror. The sound came again. It was a sigh. Rushing to the corpse, I distinctly saw, a tremor upon the lips. In a minute afterward they relaxed, disclosing a bright line of the pearly teeth. Amazement now struggled in my bosom with the profound awe which had hitherto reigned there alone. I felt that my vision grew dim, that my reason wandered, and it was only by a violent effort that I at last succeeded in nerving myself to the task which duty thus once more had pointed out. There was now a partial glow upon the forehead and upon the cheek and throat. A perceptible warmth pervaded the whole frame. There was even a slight pulsation at the heart. The lady lived. And with redoubled ardor I betook myself to the task of restoration. I chafed and bathed to the temples and the hands, and used every exertion which experience and no little medical reading could suggest, but in vain. Suddenly the color fled, the pulsation ceased, the lips resumed the expression of the dead, and in an instant afterward, the whole body took upon itself the icy chilliness, the livid hue, the rigid intensity, the sunken outline, and all the loathsome peculiarities of that which has been for many days a tenant of the tomb. And again I sunk into visions of Ligeia, and again, what marvel that I shudder while I write, again there reached my ears a low sob from the region of the ebony bed. But why shall I minutely detail the unspeakable horrors of that night? Why shall I pause to relate how, time and time, until near the period of the grey dawn, this hideous drama of revivification was repeated, how each terrific relapse was only into a sterner and apparently more irredeemable death, how each agony wore the aspect of a struggle with some invisible foe, and how each struggle was succeeded by I know not what of wild change in the personal appearance of the corpse. Let me hurry to a conclusion. The greater part of the fearful night had worn away, and she who had been dead once again stirred, and now more vigorously than hitherto, although arousing from a dissolution more appalling in its utter hopelessness than any. I had long ceased to struggle or to move, and remained sitting rigidly upon the ottoman, a helpless prey to a whirl of violent emotions, of which extreme awe was perhaps the least terrible, the least consuming. The corpse, I repeat, stirred, and now more vigorously than before. The hues of life flushed up with unwonted energy into the countenance, the limbs relaxed. And save that the eyelids were yet pressed heavily together, and that the bandages and draperies of the grave still imparted their charnel character to the figure, I might have dreamed that Rowena had indeed shaken off utterly the fetters of death. But if this idea was not, even then, altogether adopted, I could at least doubt no longer when arising from the bed, tottering with feeble steps, with closed eyes, and with the manner of one bewildered in a dream, the thing that was enshrouded advanced boldly and palpably into the middle of the apartment. I trembled not, I stirred not, for a crowd of unutterable fancies connected with the air, the stature, the demeanor of the figure, rushing hurriedly through my brain, had paralyzed, had chilled me into stone. I stirred not, but gazed upon the apparition. There was a mad disorder in my thoughts, a tumult unappeasable. Could it indeed be the living Rowena who confronted me? Could it indeed be Rowena at all, the fair-haired, the blue-eyed Lady Rowena Trevinian of Tremaine? Why? Why should I doubt it? The bandage lay heavily about the mouth, but then might it not be the mouth of the breathing Lady of Tremaine? And the cheeks, they were the roses as in her noon of life. Yes, these might indeed be the fair cheeks of the Lady of Tremaine. And the chin with its dimples as in health, might it not be hers? But had she then grown taller since her malady? What inexpressible madness seized me with that thought? One bound and I had reached her feet. Shrinking from my touch, she let fall from her head, unloosened the ghastly cerements which confined it, and there streamed forth in the rushing atmosphere of the chamber huge masses of long and disheveled hair. It was blacker than the raven wings of the midnight, and now slowly opened the eyes of the figure which stood before me. Here then at least, I shrieked aloud. Can I never be mistaken? These are the full, and the black, and the wild eyes of my lost love, of the lady Ligeia. Dun, dun, dun. Honestly, he foreshadowed that. Like, it was so obvious. He was like, I was thinking of my dead wife, and the body stirred. Oh my god, it's my dead wife. That one was actually easier to follow along with than most of Poe's. I liked that. It was a little obvious, but maybe for the people of the day, maybe twists like that weren't as commonplace, you know? Woo, I just like spasmed. Poe, is that you? Welcome in, Poe. It's good to see you again. I wanted to say listening to you is hypnotic and enjoyable. Feels more hypnotic each time you do it. Thank you. Actually, let me get through comments really quick and we will say goodnight. I'm not going to redirect tonight. Not going to redirect tonight just because we don't at the end of these streams to make it easy and palatable. Orb. I don't even know what you were trying to say, Holly. Moral of the story is hard drugs solve all your problems. This inspired. This did? Wait, are you just saying that or did it? Hard drugs solve all your problems. That is incorrect. Remember what you learned from Dare, everybody. Don't do drugs. You're the best and I love these. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Gray. All right, I'm going to give my voice a rest. I can feel it at the base of my throat that I need to stop talking for a bit. And I will see you all later. Tomorrow is my day off. I will have a schedule. I know I've been bad about making them this week, these past weeks. I'll have a schedule. We'll figure it out. Possible collab on Friday for Among Us. That's like the only thing that's settled. So thank you, everybody. It really does make me happy that you enjoy these reading streams. They're just such a personal indulgence, and they've kind of become our thing that people look forward to, and I love that. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Sorry. Thank you, madam. I did see you. I forgot to mention you. Thank you.